Muy buenos días a todos. Es un honor estar acá frente a ustedes, ver muchas caras nacionales, muchos funcionarios nacionales, pero también parlamentarios de diferentes partes del mundo, pero especialmente de nuestra querida y amada América Latina. Tengo el honor de representar la política más grande que refleja independencia y soberanía, comandada por el presidente Nayib Bukele y ejecutada por su gabinete de seguridad ampliado. También tengo que reconocer que a este foro tuvieron que pasar 30 para que por fin encontraran un país que fuera el fiel reflejo de todas esas políticas, de todas esas conferencias, de todas esas recomendaciones de diálogo, de todas esas herramientas de seguridad. Porque hoy por hoy, con mucho orgullo, somos el único país en el continente americano que ha logrado derrotar con éxito el principal enemigo de la sociedad, enemigo del Estado. Y no había una organización criminal tan grande como la que nos tocó enfrentar. Agradezco al presidente Castro por haber mostrado en una visión de un poquito más del tiempo que nos habían dado, pero mostró el avión en el que este país se ha convertido. Y estamos acá como gabinete de seguridad para poder mostrarles, como decía Dave, un poco esos secretos o esas fórmulas que hay detrás de lo que el presidente Nayib Bukele ha hecho acá en El Salvador. La presentación habla sobre la construcción de un sistema penal de Estado contra organizaciones criminales. Porque estamos seguros y convencidos de una vista 360 de solo lo que ocurre en el continente americano, que estas organizaciones criminales se han convertido en muchos países en la principal amenaza a las sociedades y a la soberanía de estos estados. No me voy a detener tanto en esto, ya el presidente Castro fue bastante explícito de dónde veníamos. Sin embargo, solo quiero resaltar en este país que recibimos en el 2019 la impunidad del homicidio, entiéndase, la rentabilidad del homicidio para el criminal generaba 97% de rentabilidad. Quiere decir que en este país era más barato matar para robar un celular, era más barato matar para que toda una comunidad entendiera que tenían que pagar la renta
extortion money to these criminal organizations. And of course, in 2019, when we got the disaster of public security from the 6 previous governments from the right and left political spectrum, the average rate of homicide was 18 per day.
Cuando se comienza a analizar, y esto lo hace el presidente,
when we started to analyze, and President Bukele started working with this since he presented his political project with the Cuscatlán plan, we started to analyze the phenomenon of gangs, because in this picture you see internationally, you understand that gangs were not born in this country. This country, after the war, was governed by criminal gangs that steal, rob banks. Gangs are the phenomenon that you know where this was born, and this came imported from the United States, and it was successfully imported into El Salvador. But this phenomenon was not as described by all the books, all the academia. That was not organized crime per se, because there are United Nations conventions on criminality that talk about this, but gangs were not only a criminal organization. In reality, they were a living organism. In addition, they controlled territory because the governments endorsed key elements of the rule of law. These gangs control more than 85% of the territory. Who do you think were the ones bringing quote-unquote justice to communities? Do you think it was the police officer, the judge, the mayor? No. In our community, those implementing justice were gang members. Of course, they had their tax collection, extortion collection mechanisms, and they were even more successful than our Ministry of Finance. They collected this extortion money. They were an army of thugs or serial killers. And of course, they were those in command of jails in the country, and because of that lack of sovereignty, we didn't understand how gangs were terrorist organizations, because in our mindset we used to call just terrorist ISIS, Al Qaeda, because they were the ones that we were told to call terrorists. Even if we had a cluster of serial killers here, but we didn't want to call them terrorists at that time. But they were not only terrorists, they were a criminal parallel state, and therefore the design of the strategy didn't include following the path of other countries to take down these criminal organizations. And it wasn't just about including laws against terrorism. Of course, we can see this weakening of the institutions after the war, as President Castro mentioned, where we can find some mistakes that were made. Excuse me, the previous one. These mistakes I refuse to call them a mistake, but let's assume for the sake of the conversation that they were mistakes. In the 90s, these evil minds prepared all the scenario so this country could have gangs being the real authority in our communities, starting in the year 2000s. Of course, they gutted immunity laws for minors. In 1997, they passed this law. But that was not enough. They gave us a disaster of criminal code, which is still being celebrated by many judges and officials. That was the useless criminal code. You could not use that to win the war against criminal organizations. And then we started with all the quote-unquote severe measures, starting with President Paco Flores, President Tony Saca in 2006. Then in this menu of recipes they had there was a very beautiful name. Let's give El Salvador a law against organized crime. That is like to see a shark, but when you realize that shark doesn't have any teeth. Toothless shark. But the dinosaurs that were controlling the Legislative Assembly by that time and that were in the government, they were celebrating, and they told us as citizens that we were going to have the tool to defeat our enemies. This law against organized crime. What did they do with it? Nothing. There was just one more recipe to the menu. And in the 2000s, when they started to have gangs dominating communities, funny enough, reporters, international reporters and journalists started to praise and to present how these organizations killed, because they had to they started to create a concept in the collective mind. They wanted us to believe that this was too big and that sooner or later, as conservative citizens, we were going to get bored of this right political parties, and that eventually someone else was going to start governing, someone that came from the same place that President Castro mentioned. Guerrilla members joined the Legislative Assembly. That's why it is important to mention that all of those people that were living for a year with gang members, to write a book that was going to become an Amazon bestseller, were part of this, and they made us believe that it was impossible to defeat this, because they knew as well that we would have a government from the left. And actually the only ones that would buy that narrative were the left governments, because having authorities here such as OAS, even the church, surrendered to this path that they wanted to create. So these serial killers, I'm going to share another situation with you. In order to become a member of this gang, this is like a franchise. It wasn't born here. We imported it. But in order to be a member of a gang in the United States, the gang member, when they want to become a member, they have to kill one person. That's how they do it in the United States, that's how they do it in Europe, that's how they do it in Guatemala, in El Salvador. In order to become a gang member, you had to kill 10 people. This is just for you to have an idea of the level of serial murderers. But we can say this right, because not because we're making this up or because we just wanted to sound nice, but because they really were serial killers. So we didn't understand how these international organizations could come and celebrate such a disaster. But also in that decade, the decade of the 2010, since the changes they implemented in 2007 didn't give any results, they invented new changes in this legal code to give new tools to the criminals. And funny enough, and even if it seems as a lie in this world of hyperconnectivity in which we are, in the reforms that they have presented in our neighbor country of Guatemala, that's the same recipe that we were introduced in 2011. So I can tell you that Guatemala is going nowhere with that reform, because these are the same reforms that we had in 2011. Next. Of course, with all of that background, we knew that we were facing a parallel criminal state, a terrorist organization formed by serial killers, but in addition, they had a physiognomy or a personality. They had their own personality. They had their own personality, which I believe will be discussed later. You will notice what we did in this country in order to make progress with criminal laws. And how we created new theories of categories. We're laying the foundation, and we're the pioneers in the crime of belonging to these organizations. This, which was mentioned by President Castro, what happened in 2022 was something that left us just with one option, one constitutional tool to recover the rule of law, because we didn't have any rule of law. And for those who like to go to these UN or OAS organizations, before with the 6 previous presidents that we had, we had a rule of law here in the country because they wanted us to be violent, they wanted us to be suffering, because nothing of what happened in the previous 30 years allowed us to make progress, to develop our economy, because we were exporting or the labor or people, which was the most valuable asset, but we're no longer that country. So, I'm not going to stop a lot on this because President Castro mentioned that, but we have the different phases, and since we're talking about formulas, the phase 1, before that or behind that, you find President Bukele, the government of President Nayib Bukele, that become in 2019, we became the first state, the first country to have the authority to dominate in the jails. There are no other countries in the region. Criminals rule jails in other countries. And these are facts. Where was born the Mexican mafia that dominates all the gangs in Mexico? They were born in the jails of the United States. Where did Tren de Aragua was born? They were born in the Venezuelan prisons. Comando Vermelho in the Brazilian prisons. And here in our prisons, you join because of theft. And you used to live being a gang member. So our prisons became the main source of gang members. You went into prison as a common criminal, and you left prison as a gang member. And we have evidence for that. We like to say that we are the only country in the region that has control over its prisons. But because we were able to do it. And the dinosaurs we used to have in the Legislative Assembly, they were not able to do anything about it. And then in phases 1, 2, and 3, President Bukele had to live with that assembly full of dinosaurs. See the change that we had starting in 2021. We take actions because thanks to the popular decision, we had the majority in the assembly, and we allow the president to start implementing this war operation against the criminal organization, which is one of the largest and strongest of the region. I just want to highlight the thing that happened on that Saturday. As President Castro mentioned, we had 62 murders on March the 6th of 2022. And by popular decision as well, we coordinated the legislative and executive branch of the government to take these brave and right decisions. And of course, even if it might seem as high, in that picture we don't see any other magic formulas beyond the selection of the security cabinet. And this is also a work, strategic and brilliant work of our President Bukele. Just to share something with you, turns out that the evil people and the dinosaurs that we had before, in addition to laws that they imposed, they had another safeguard, and that was having this eternal conflict between the police and the army, the police and the Attorney General's office, and everybody was fighting each other. So for the selection of the security cabinet, which I see as a wheel with 4 bolts, the weapons we had in these countries, they were given to 2 men that, beyond their experience as military and as police officer, they were friends, they were brothers. Yeah, because it is very important for this kind of situations to break this permanent conflict that was just beneficiating criminals, terrorist organizations. And on the other hand, we had attorney generals and a Ministry of Justice. We knew each other as well. We are friends as well. And the 4 of us, we built what we called the security cabinet, but we're just a group of friends, a group of experts who are giving the best recommendations to the president, and we're implementing his instructions. And notice that this is an important part of the formula. You can have everything. You can come to El Salvador and copy all the laws you want. But if the officials of these institutions in charge of bringing peace and prosperity don't know each other, if they are not friends, if they don't get along, criminals, organized crime will always win. We have lived that in this country. I have already lived that. And we started, I just want to highlight something very important here. In our doctrine, We don't see accused people. We're seeing criminals belonging to these organizations. We understand that the organization has a personality. Of course, they have elements they take from the state, but in addition to that, they have this criminal monopoly that what we used to call HIT in the analysis: homicide, extortion, weapons, and traffic. And this was essential to make the reform and to know which laws we were going to modify, which laws from this menu that we were left with by these dinosaurs. And if we knew that the criminal organizations committed homicide, extortion, drug trafficking, why is the punishment for this crime the joke they were? Now we don't wait until there is a homicide, until we start with investigation, waiting for the results, waiting for the results of the autopsy or the analysis. No, because the organization is the one setting the enemy, and that organization has their own personality, because when they ordered homicide, the organization was the one deciding who was going to kill and who was going to be killed. And out of the 87 homicides that you saw on the slides, on that weekend, the organization had authorized 400 homicides. It wasn't the willingness or the volunteer of the murderers. It was the decision of the organization. That's why we understood which were the laws that we had to change. Of course, in 2021, I remember these dinosaurs, we had to give them a little bit of, let's say, treats so they could make changes in some laws, because if they opposed the changes in these laws, they were going to go against the society. So we had increased the penalty for the illegal weapon possession, because I don't know how these states have these penalties for the illegal possession of weapons. They are waiting for that weapon to be used